In Ottawa, in the House of Commons, the leaders of all the parties were talking about Wet'suwet'en. Here are their remarks. This is James with Net News Ledger.
Made earlier today, the House will now proceed to statements by ministers. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to begin by recognizing that we are on the ancestral land of the Algonquin people. Mr. Speaker, people are troubled by what they've been witnessing this past week. Young, old, Indigenous, newcomers, they're asking themselves what is happening in this country. They're asking what lies ahead for themselves, for their communities, for Canada. They know that these protests are serious, that this is a critical moment for our country and for our future. And so do I. On all sides, people are upset and frustrated. I get it. It's understandable, because this is about things that matter. Rights and livelihoods, the rule of law, and our democracy. Aux gens qui subissent les conséquences des barrages et des manifestations, vous traversez des moments difficiles. Sachez que notre gouvernement travaille fort pour trouver une solution. Notre priorité est de résoudre la situation de manière pacifique, mais aussi de protéger notre pays comme un État de droit. Nous allons toujours défendre ce principe. It is time, past time, for this situation to be resolved. But what we are facing was not created overnight. It was not created because we have embarked upon a path of reconciliation recently in our history. It is because for too long in our history, for too many years, we failed to do so. So finding a solution will not be simple. It will take determination, hard work, and cooperation. There is no relationship more important to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. And today, as Prime Minister, I am once again formally extending my hand in partnership and trust. Over the last 11 days, our government has been working on a path forward, even as many have been saying we should give up. Because we know what is at stake. We know that we cannot afford to fail. So we are creating a space for peaceful, honest dialogue with willing partners. As we heard this morning from Mohawk leaders and from National Chief Perry Bellegarde, we need to resolve this through dialogue and mutual respect. To the Wet'suwet'en and Mohawk nations and Indigenous leaders across the country, we are listening. We are not asking that you stop standing up for your communities, your rights, and for what you believe. We only ask that you be willing to work with the federal government as a partner in finding solutions. You remind us, rightly so, that too often trust has been betrayed in the history of Indigenous negotiations with Canadian governments. In fact, that underlines the difficulty of solving this situation today. But our common ground is the desire to arrive at solutions. We cannot resolve this alone. Just like we need Indigenous leaders to be partners, we also need Canadians to show both resolve and collaboration. Everyone has a stake in getting this right. Soyons clairs, Notre gouvernement va continuer de travailler
Let's be
jour et
clear,
nuit
our
pour
government will
rapidement
continue to
et
work
paisiblement
night and day
trouver une solution.
to peacefully
Dans le passé,
find a
nous avons
solution.
vu à quel point ces
In the past,
situations
we have
peuvent changer
seen
rapidement.
just how quickly these
Je sais
situations
qu'on
can
veut
change.
tous trouver une
I
solution.
know that we
En même
all
temps,
want to find a
il faut
solution.
absolument éviter
And at
que
the
les
same
choses
time,
s'aggravent.
we must prevent
Hier,
the
j'ai
situation from
encore une fois
worsening.
réuni les membres du groupe
Yesterday,
d'intervention en
I
cas
again
d'incident
convened to the
pour
incident
discuter de la
response group
situation et de
to
la marche à
discuss the
suivre.
situation and our
Je me suis
path
également
forward.
entretenu avec les premiers ministres
I have
provinciaux
also
pour parler
spoken
des
with
conséquences
premiers
qu'ont les barrages sur
across
les
the country
agriculteurs,
of
les
the impact
entrepreneurs,
of
les familles, les
blockades
travailleurs
on
d'un bout de ce pays à l'autre.
workers, farmers, businesses across
Over the
the country.
weekend, the Minister of Indigenous Services met with representatives from Tyendinaga as well as other members of the Mohawk Nation. And I have committed to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs that the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations will meet with them anytime. And I hope that the offer will be accepted. This is our opportunity now to bring these perspectives together. Because, Mr. Speaker, what is the alternative? Do we want to become a country of irreconcilable differences, where people talk but refuse to listen, where politicians are ordering police to arrest people, a country where people think they can tamper with rail lines and endanger lives? This is simply unacceptable. We cannot solve these problems on the margins. That is not the way forward. I know that people's patience is running short. We need to find a solution, and we need to find it now. I have spoken in this House about how my father faced protests over the debate about Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Constitution. Over 30 years later, many of those questions still linger, which is why our pace of change must be even faster. And not only in this situation. Despite having invested more than any other government to right historic wrongs, to close persistent gaps, we know that there is still more, much more, to be done. It is unacceptable that there are people who still don't have access to clean drinking water, that Indigenous women and girls still go missing and are murdered, that there are people without housing and good education. It is unacceptable that Indigenous peoples are still denied rights and lands, Mr. Speaker. So we need to keep finding solutions. And that can only happen by working together and by listening. Monsieur le Président, en tant que pays,
Mr. Speaker, as
nous
a
sommes
country,
appelés à choisir la marche à suivre.
we are called upon
C'est
to
à nous
find a
de
path
choisir
forward.
le
It is
respect
our job
et la
to choose
communication.
respect
Nous
and
ne devons pas
communication.
nous engager dans une voie où nous refusons
We must
d'écouter,
not embark upon
où
a
nous
path where we
cédons
refuse to
aux
listen
hostilités.
or where we give in to
Ce n'est pas la
hostilities.
solution.
That is not the
There
solution.
are those who would want us to act in haste, who want us to boil this down to slogans and ignore the complexities, who think that using force is helpful. It is not. Patience may be in short supply, and that makes it more valuable than ever. Indigenous rights, climate action, law and order, building a clean economy, we will not achieve these things by degrading our
Interrupt the Honourable Prime Minister. This is a very serious topic that we're discussing today, and I'm starting to hear heckling from both sides, which really troubles me. I just want everyone to take a deep breath and listen to the speakers that we have today. We have more coming. The Honourable Prime Minister.
I think I might repeat my last sentence. Patience may be in short supply, and that makes it more valuable than ever. Mr. Speaker, in this country, we're facing many important and deep debates. Debates about the future livelihoods of our children, the future of our environment, our relations with countries around the world, our positioning on things that are fundamental at a time of anxiety. And more Canadians are impatient to see those answers. More and more people are frustrated that there is such uncertainty. And more we see those debates carried with increasing intensity on the margins of our democratic conversations. The place for these debates is here in this House. The place for these debates are around kitchen tables and community centres in this country. And yes, there is always a place for Canadians to protest and express their frustrations. But we need to ensure that we are also listening to each other. The reality of populism, Mr. Speaker, and its siren song in our democracies these days is a desire to listen only to oneself and to people who agree with them, and not with people of another perspective. And the concern with action before discussion, the need for reasoned debate in this place is at the center of what we have to continue to move forward with as a country. Indigenous rights, climate action, law and order, building a clean economy, we will not achieve these things by degrading our democracy. We must be honest about why we are here. We must be open to working together to move forward, and not just in the days ahead. But as we make progress on everything from implementing Indigenous rights and title, addressing historic wrongs, and ending long-term drinking water advisories, as a country and as a government, we need to continue the work we are doing. And we need to continue to walk this road together. To everyone, I say we are extending our hands in good faith for dialogue. The opportunity is there on the table right now. We are in this together. The worker, the senior, the Indigenous leader, the protester, and the police officer. Let us have the courage to take this opportunity and take action together, and so to build a better path for all Canadians. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that was the weakest response to a national crisis in Canadian history. I listened to the Prime Minister's word salad just now, Mr. Speaker, and at least two key things were missing. A clear denunciation that the actions of these radical activists are illegal, and some kind of an action plan that would put an end to the illegal blockades and get our economy back on track. The Prime Minister's statement was a complete abdication of responsibility and of leadership. Je viens d'écouter la salade de mots du Premier Ministre.
I listened to the Prime Minister's word salad just now. At least two key things were missing: a clear denunciation that the actions of these radical activists are illegal, and some kind of action plan to end these illegal blockades and put our economy back on track. The Prime Minister's statement was a complete abdication of responsibility and a failure of leadership.
Mr. Speaker, we are at an important time in our country's history, a time when we will have to decide who and what our country stands for. Will we be a country of yes, where big national projects can get built and our country can grow and develop? Or will our country be a country of no, where a few loud voices can shut down development and prosperity for all? Will our country be one of the rule of law, or will our country be one of the rule of the mob? Will we let our entire economy be held hostage by a small group, trampling over the legal system which has governed our country for more than 150 years? Because let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, standing between our country and prosperity is a small group of radical activists, many of whom have little to no connection to First Nations communities. A bunch of radical activists who won't rest until our oil and gas industry is entirely shut down. Now, they may have the luxury of not having to go to work every day. They may have the luxury of not facing repercussions for skipping class, but they are blockading our ports, our railways, and our borders. and our roads and highways. And they are appropriating an Indigenous agenda which they are willfully misrepresenting. And, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's elevation of these protesters to the same level as the thousands of men and women in First Nations communities across our country who have in good faith been trying to right the wrongs of Canadian history does a disservice to the spirit of reconciliation. Prime Minister has emboldened and encouraged this kind of behavior by cancelling other big projects based on political consideration instead of on science and on facts. Permettez-moi d'être clair, Monsieur le Président.
Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. A radical group of activists is opposing our country, and many of whom have little or no connections to First Nation communities. A bunch of radical activists who won't rest until our oil and gas industry is entirely shut down. They're blocking our ports, our railways, our borders, our roads and highways.
The reality is that a vast majority of members of the Wet'suwet'en people support the Coastal Gaslink project. Every single elected band council on the Coastal Gaslink route supports this project. Even the majority of hereditary chiefs support this project, Mr. Speaker. And the vast majority of First Nations community members themselves support this project because this project will create jobs, it will create opportunities, and it will lead to investments in their communities. And in the end, it will help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. This is a fantastic opportunity for the Wet'suwet'en people, Mr. Speaker. So why are these radical activists opposing this project? Because for them, this is just a warm-up act. A warm-up act for what they consider to be the next fights against Trans Mountain, against Tech Frontier, and in the end, their goal is the entire shutdown of our energy industry. Now, it's important to remember who the victim of this all has been. Who has been victimized by Liberal inaction? It's the farmer who can't get their grain to market. It's the small business owners who can't get their shipments in time. It's the homeowners who may face trouble getting their home heating for the winter. It's the workers facing layoffs. And the ultimate victims are the Wet'suwet'en members themselves looking for prosperity for their children, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Conservatives have been calling for common sense and appropriate recommendations to end these illegal blockades. We've called on the Liberal government to enforce the rule of law. What we were expecting today was some sort of an announcement about a plan that would put an end to these illegal blockades.
Conservatives have been bringing forward common sense and appropriate recommendations to end these illegal blockades.
Literally nothing. Now, let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. Every single Canadian has the right to free speech. Everyone has the right to say their piece, regardless how much we may agree or disagree. But nobody, and I mean nobody, has the right to hold our economy hostage, Mr. Speaker.
Everyone has the right to say their piece, regardless of how much we may agree or disagree with the message. But nobody has the right to hold our economy hostage.
Across our country are illegal, and it's time the government stepped in and did something about that. On this side of the House, we stand with the farmers. On this side of the House, we stand with commuters. On this side of the House, we stand with workers facing layoffs. We stand with everyday, hard-working Canadians. Most importantly, on this side of the House, we stand in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people. We stand in solidarity with the elected councillors of the Wet'suwet'en First Nations. We stand in solidarity with the majority of hereditary chiefs from the Wet'suwet'en First Nation who recognize that these types of projects and investments are the only way to lift First Nations Canadians out of poverty, give them hope and opportunity, and give the next generation of Indigenous Canadians the same quality of life that everyone else in this country enjoys.
député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly.
Je suis obligé, Monsieur le Président, de nuancer les termes du chef conservateur lorsqu'il dit de ce côté-ci de la Chambre.
When he says
Nous
on
sommes
this
du
side of
même
the
bord de la
House.
Chambre, mais
We are on the
manifestement,
same side of the House.
vous ne verrez
But
jamais
obviously,
quelqu'un du Bloc
you will
québécois
never see someone from
se
the
placer
Bloc
au centre
Quebecois
d'une Première
put
Nation et de
themselves
dire parmi vous, il y a
in the
les
middle of a
bandits,
First Nations and say
il y a
that
les
there's
gentils qui
bandits
sont d'accord avec nous
and there's
autres.
nice people that agree with us over
Qui
here.
sommes-nous?
Who are we?
Nous, et disons-le franchement, la société blanche.
Are frankly white
Qui
society.
sommes-nous pour nous insérer entre
Who
eux et
are
commencer
we
à les juger les uns
to
et
get
les
in
autres
between them and start
selon
judging
qu'ils sont
them
d'accord avec l'intérêt du moment ou
based on
pas?
whether they agree with our interests of the moment or not?
Alors la ligne entre ce côté de la
And
Chambre
so
ou
the
pas ici.
line cannot be here.
Outre ça,
Other than that,
Monsieur le Président, je suis quand même
I
obligé
am required
de demander au Premier ministre,
to ask
mais
the
ma
Prime
foi,
Minister
pourquoi 12 jours?
why 12 days?
Pourquoi a-t-il fallu qu'une crise
Why
qui s'annonçait
Did it
nationale et
take a
grave,
crisis that was
dès ses
going to
tout
be
débuts,
national and serious from its very
n'a-t-il
beginning?
d'intervention de sa part qu'au terme de
Why
12 jours?
was there no involvement
Outre
until
ça,
12
pourquoi
days
ai-je
later?
l'impression que je
And
viens
why do I
d'entendre
have
un
the
discours
impression that
électoral
I
de
just heard
2015?
an election speech from 2015
Des énoncés de valeurs, de principes,
talking
de
about
vertus,
values and principles and
plus
virtues,
louables les uns et les unes que les autres,
each one more
avec,
virtuous than the
en effet,
last,
rien.
with nothing.
Je comprends qu'une négociation
I
doit exister
understand
quelque part.
that
Je comprends
negotiation has
qu'il
to
doit y avoir
happen
des
somewhere.
canaux de
There
communication
has to
qui
be
sont
channels of
ouverts.
communication that are open.
Et je peux comprendre que
And
le
I
Premier
can
ministre ne veuille
understand
pas
that the
négocier
Prime
sur la
Minister
place publique.
doesn't want
OK.
to negotiate
Mais tu
in a
convoques
public
pas le
forum.
Parlement
Fine.
pour faire
But one
une
does not
adresse
assemble the Parliament
ministérielle
to
si t'as rien
give
à
a
dire.
ministerial statement with nothing
Et
to
c'est
say.
manifestement ce à
And
quoi on vient d'assister.
Obviously, that is what we have just
Les
seen.
pistes de solutions ne semblent pas beaucoup plus claires.
The solutions
Les
don't
pistes
seem any more
d'erreur,
clear.
elles, par contre, se
The mistakes,
précisent.
however, are becoming
Alors, parce
more
qu'on est dans
clear.
le « ou ». C'est comme s'il fallait, en
It's
cette
as
Chambre,
though,
aujourd'hui,
in
décider
this place,
entre
we had to decide between
un respect nécessaire pour les Premières
necessary
Nations
respect
ou ben
for
donc
First
l'économie
Nations
canadienne.
or the Canadian
Comme
economy,
si c'était d'emblée
as though
et irrémédiablement
it
pas
were
conciliable. Comme s'il n'était pas
irreconcilable,
possible de trouver
as
une
though it were not
solution à la
possible to find a
crise
solution
qui
to the
permette,
crisis
en effet, de
that
remettre en
would
mouvement de grands morceaux de l'économie
put
canadienne et
large
québécoise
sectors
sans
of the
pour autant
Canadian
le faire
and
au détriment
Quebec economy
de ce que
back
veulent
into play
avoir comme discussion
without
les Premières Nations.
undermining what the First
je
Nations
pense
want
que
to
c'est possible.
discuss. I think that's possible.
Et je vais faire un très, très bref
And
détour.
I would like to
Je
very
dis encore une
briefly
fois, qui sommes-nous pour juger?
say,
Parce qu'après
who are
tout,
we to judge?
on se revendique de la
Because
légitimité de nos
we
démarches
say that we're legitimate in our
en invoquant
processes,
une loi adoptée en 1876
invoking a
qui a
law
imposé
passed in
aux Premières Nations un modèle de
1876 that
gouvernance
imposed
qui
a
venait
model
de
of
notre grande
governance to First
supériorité
Nations that
blanche.
came from our great white
Et il y en a
superiority.
parmi eux qui disent hey, on n'est pas
And
sûr
there
que
are
c'est la
some who
meilleure
say, we're
méthode.
not sure that this is the
Ce
best way.
débat-là, à quelque part,
That
leur
debate
appartient.
belongs to them.
Et c'est beaucoup de ça qu'il est question.
And that is what we are
Alors, on
dealing with
a un
today.
peu une obligation
We have
entre écoute et
an
respect.
obligation
Et
between
à cet égard-là, je
listening
suis
and
d'accord
being
que le
respectful.
gouvernement veuille
And I
initier,
agree that the
enfin,
government
dirais-je, une
should
conversation.
finally
Par
initiate a
contre,
conversation.
il y a certainement des zones de
However,
tension existantes.
There are existing areas of
On ne
tension.
peut pas avoir oublié
We cannot forget
qu'il n'y a pas si longtemps,
that not so long
le
ago,
gouvernement a soit autorisé,
the government
soit fermé
either
les yeux
authorized or
sur la
closed its eyes
disposition
on
de tireurs d'élite près
the
du territoire des Wet'suwet'en.
placing snipers
Il me
around
semble qu'il y a
Wet'suwet'en
là matière à
territory.
créer un petit peu
It
de
seems to
tension.
me that could create a
Il me
little
semble
bit of
qu'il y a là
tension.
matière à ce que des
It
gens
seems to
disent
me
« Je me
that
sens
people
pas en
could say,
confiance ».
I don't feel that I have
Alors
a lot
après
of
ça,
confidence right
dire
now.
« Écoutez, nous ne devons pas
We
entreprendre un parcours vers la tension et la violence ». Ben, je suis
head towards
profondément
violence and
d'accord.
tension, and I
Il fallait
agree with
commencer
that
par ne
tension,
pas permettre
with
ça.
that statement rather. We
Et
should
dans
not
cette
start with
litanie
that.
d'excuses à laquelle
And
on a
in the
assisté au
litany
fil
of
des ans,
excuses
ben
we've seen
voici
over the
une
years.
maudite belle occasion
Well, here's a
de
really
s'excuser
great
d'avoir
opportunity
permis
to
de laisser
apologize for
passer une
having
affaire du genre,
allowed
qui est
such a thing,
certainement une graine fondamentale dans la crise que nous vivons.
a seed of the crisis
Je ne
we're
voudrais
currently
pas, toutefois,
experiencing.
On
However,
interprète mon propos
I
comme
don't
étant
want to
une
be
caution
interpreted
des
as
gestes.
taking a
Ça
position
ne
against
peut pas
action.
durer.
This crisis cannot last.
Il y a des appels à la raison qui ont été
There are
faits
calls to reason that have been
par
made,
des gens des Premières Nations mêmes.
made by First Nations, namely.
Et j'imagine le sentiment un peu d'apaisement qu'on
I
a
would
tous
imagine that
vécu en se
the
disant, OK, peut-être que
feeling
de leur propre initiative, il y
of
aurait
relief
des
we felt
conversations, des
was that
possibilités,
there
des
might be,
apaisements
from their own initiative,
permettraient
be solutions and
la
conversations
nécessaire et
that would
urgente
allow
levée des
for
obstructions.
the removal of the blockades.
Une négociation, ça passe forcément par des gens qui posent des
Negotiation
gestes en réponse
requires
des
people
gestes
to
de l'autre.
act in response to the other
Il
party's
faudra aller là.
actions. We're going
Il
to have to move
faudra
in that
s'ouvrir
direction.
aussi
We'll also
à la
have to remain
différence
open
culturelle
to cultural
profonde et
differences
fondamentale
that are
plutôt que
deep and
d'imposer
profound, rather
grossièrement,
than
à coups de poing sur les pupitres, nos valeurs à nous.
imposing our values with our
Alors
fists
que
on
les
our
Premières
desks.
Nations ont le droit
The First
à la
Nations
différence.
have the right to difference.
Et je pense qu'il est nécessaire que
And I
nous ayons
think
ce
it is
recul,
necessary
cette prudence.
for us to take a step back
Si
and be
la
cautious.
position qu'ils ont
If the
face au
position
dossier de
that they
Gaslink n'est
have
pas
when it
unanime
comes
entre eux, je pense qu'il
against
faut
this
au moins
situation, if the
avoir
position is not unanimous, we
la
should
sagesse
at
de
least have
dégager
the
un
wisdom
espace pour qu'ils puissent,
to make
eux,
some
avoir
space
notamment
for
entre
them
eux
to have
cette
amongst
nécessaire
themselves
conversation.
this conversation that
Maintenant,
is so
quels
very
sont les gestes
necessary.
qu'il faudra poser
But what actions
Au-delà
must be
des-
taken
au-delà des discours,
beyond speeches,
au-delà des valeurs autrement fort
beyond
louables?
values which are, of course,
Je me
entirely
demande
laudable?
s'il n'est pas
I
nécessaire,
wonder
mais
if it is
j'ai pas
not
autorité.
necessary, but I don't have
Moi,
the
je parle juste
authority.
pour le Québec, je suis un
I'm just
observateur,
speaking
mais
for
le
Quebec.
Québec,
I'm an observer.
parlez-en à mon
But
collègue,
Quebec, you can
subit
talk to my colleague about
un impact
this,
économique majeur de
is
cette
being
crise-là.
subjected to the major economic impact
Je
of
me
this
demande
crisis.
s'il n'y a pas lieu
I'm
d'obtenir,
wondering
puisque
if
c'est
there's
une
not an
juridiction
opportunity,
de la Colombie-Britannique
because
et que nous,
it's
ici, on
a
respecte
jurisdiction
les juridictions des provinces.
for British
S'il n'y a
Columbia,
pas
and we
lieu
respect provincial
d'obtenir,
jurisdictions,
ne
is there
serait-ce que
no
de façon
way,
temporaire, une
if only
suspension
temporary,
complète des travaux,
a
on dit,
temporary
écoutez, on va regarder,
suspension
on va se
of
parler,
construction,
et en échange de
and say,
quoi, on pourrait
we'll
demander,
talk,
en toute
perhaps
légitimité,
we could
aux gens des
ask
Premières
entirely
Nations
legitimately people
de
in
lever
First
les différentes
Nations
barricades à travers le
to
Canada et
raise
le
the different
Québec.
barricades throughout Canada
Je
and
pense qu'il y a
Quebec.
un geste mesurable,
think
clair et concret
That there's a
qui,
clear
très
measure
possiblement,
that could
serait
be
reçu
taken, which
par les Premières
could
Nations
be well
comme
received by First Nations.
une ouverture
It could
réelle
be
au-delà des
perceived
mots
as
qui,
real
dans les
openness
dernières années,
beyond
n'ont
words,
trop
which
souvent amené que
over
des
the
déceptions.
last several years have only
Alors moi,
led to
j'invite,
disappointment many times.
bien sûr, le gouvernement
I
à
invite the government
concrétiser tout ça,
to make everything
faire une
real,
proposition claire et mesurable,
to make a
dont
measured
j'espère qu'elle sera bien
proposal,
reçue, parce que je
which I
réitère
hope
que
will
le
be well
moyen n'est
received.
pas acceptable et qu'il fait
I
aussi
have
mal à
to
l'économie des
say
Premières Nations
that
qu'à
harming
celle
First
de la
Nations
société
economies
canadienne et
and the
québécoise en
Canadian
général.
and Quebec society's
Il faut que ça
economies
se fasse
is
vite,
not
il faut que ça se
acceptable.
fasse clair, et si tel est le cas,
The intervention must be quick,
vous
it
aurez
must be
notre
clear,
collaboration.
and if that is the case, you will have our full cooperation.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to acknowledge that while the Prime Minister has spoken today on a very important crisis, the Prime Minister has not shown leadership on this matter for over a month. I want to begin my comments by acknowledging the fact that it's inspiring to see the youth rising, to see people of all walks of life who are standing up for human rights, who are standing up for climate justice. Je suis inspiré par la jeunesse, les jeunes qui se battent pour l'environnement,
who are
pour les
fighting
droits de
for
la
the
personne.
environment and
C'est
human
inspirant.
rights. It's inspiring.
But I also want to acknowledge the feelings of helplessness and uncertainty that many farmers, local producers, business folks are feeling right now. I know there's a lot of workers that are now not being able to go to work. There's a lot of people that are worried about whether or not they're going to be able to make ends meet because of the impacts. I'm thinking about all these people right now, all Canadians. But I'm thinking about the people at the blockade who are standing up because they are so frustrated. They are so angry, and they're right to be angry. See, the context of what's going on, something the Prime Minister alluded to, is a deep frustration. It's historic, absolutely. The injustice, the bitter and horrible injustice faced by the first people of this land, if you have any compassion, your heart would result in some frustration, some anger. This is a serious crisis that we're faced with. It's not, sadly, what the Prime Minister referred to it as, quote, an infrastructure disruption. Ce que se passe maintenant au Canada, c'est
What is
vraiment
happening
une
now
crise
in
sérieuse.
Canada is a serious crisis.
Canadians are expecting us all to show some leadership. They're also expecting the Prime Minister to show leadership. But sadly, the reality is the Prime Minister has let a lot of those people down. There's been centuries of broken promises to Indigenous people. And those broken promises aren't just broken words, but have resulted in massive injustice, have resulted in massive inequality, and resulted in the deaths of Indigenous people. Indigenous people have been denied basic human rights. Now, the Prime Minister promised to be different, but he broke those promises, and he didn't show to be very different. Let's look at his record. The Prime Minister will talk about, and the government, the Liberal government will talk about the record, but let's look at the record right now. What is going on in our country? We've got a Human Rights Tribunal decision that found that the government didn't just underfund or discriminate Indigenous kids, but they did so recklessly, willfully, purposefully. On top of that, to add insult to injury, this government is taking those kids to court and not even being clear about how many millions of dollars are spending fighting these First Nation kids in court. Not only in child welfare has this Prime Minister and this Liberal government let down First Nations, Inuit and Métis when it comes to the funding of education for First Nations, when it comes to the underfunding of programs. Something as simple as a program to allow women to rightfully reclaim status, that program has been underfunded. There's been massive inconsistencies with what the Prime Minister says and then what the Prime Minister does. We're in the year 2020. I can accept no excuse that the Liberal government, coming off of a 5-year majority, can ensure that every single Indigenous community in this country has clean drinking water. There is no excuse. With the technology and the wealth of our country, there is no excuse why clean drinking water as a right could not be assured. C'est complètement inacceptable.
It is completely unacceptable. And it is not understandable how in 2020 we cannot achieve the goals of ensuring that every Indigenous community has access to drinking water.
On top of that, when a young activist raised concerns about clean drinking water in our community at a private fundraiser, the Prime Minister mocks that young person in front of his wealthy donors. That's the response of this Prime Minister. And that's a part of why this crisis is where it is right now. The Prime Minister said that he knew better than elders and that what young Indigenous people really needed was just a place to store their paddles and their canoes. I mean, that does not show a respect of the seriousness and the gravity of the problems that colonialism has left on the first people of this land. And now speaking about the current issue. The Wet'suwet'en chiefs, nearly more than a month ago, made a request for the federal government to play a role. They specifically asked for the Prime Minister, they specifically asked for the federal government to play a role in resolving this conflict. Now, we asked the question, New Democrats asked the question to this government weeks ago. At the time, that question was laughed off. At the time, the Prime Minister said it was not his problem. He said, quote, entirely under provincial jurisdiction. Well, I'm glad to see the Prime Minister understands now that a nation-to-nation relationship means that all levels of government must play a role. And that means the Prime Minister must play a role. Hear, hear. It's encouraging, Madam Speaker, to see that the Prime Minister is not calling for police to be sent in. We've seen the consequences of that type of response, and we do not want to go there. But it's troubling. Madam Speaker. It's troubling that it's taken so long for the Prime Minister to realize that there is a role for him to play and for the federal government to play. C'est tellement troublant que ça a pris assez de temps pour le gouvernement de réaliser qu'ils ont un rôle à jouer pour régler cette crise.
In order to solve this crisis.
Now, the fix or the solution to all of this, it's going to require hard work. It's going to require that we respect the principles of a nation-to-nation relationship. And that means having dialogue, having conversations. And that means the Prime Minister and the federal government have to play a role. It means we need to find a peaceful way forward. It means we need to find a way that respects human rights, the freedom of press, and most of all, the fundamental rights of Indigenous people. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission laid out a path forward. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People lays a course forward. But the TRC's path forward are calls to action, not calls to empty words. It's time for this government to back up those words. It's time for the Prime Minister to back up the words with real action. C'est maintenant le moment.
Pour les actions
now is the time for real action.
Ce n'est pas le temps pour les belles paroles.
It is not time for fine words.
C'est le moment pour des actions concrètes pour
it's
régler
time for real measures to solve the problem.
Réaliser la justice pour la communauté
to
autochtone.
ensure that there's justice for Indigenous communities.
This is our chance to do better. Not to just say better, but to actually do better. Now, if the Prime Minister is ready to move forward in a path of justice and fairness, then he can count on the New Democrats to work together to delivering real solutions that see a path forward for justice and fairness and that see a path forward out of this crisis. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Honorable député de Saanich, go for it.
The honourable member for Saanich,
Merci,
go
Madame la
finance.
Présidente. Merci
Thank you,
à tous
Madam
mes
Speaker,
collègues
and
pour
thank you to all of my
l'opportunité
colleagues
aussi
for
de
the opportunity
parler un peu, de prendre la parole
speak a
sur cette
little
situation
about
d'urgence,
this
situation
urgent situation.
qui demande à tout le monde, qui
This
exige
situation
pour tous et tous
requires
de faire face à la
absolutely
réalité
everyone
de
to face reality, the
et le
reality of
défi de
injustice,
réconciliation.
and the challenge of
This is a
reconciliation.
very important debate, and this is a very important moment. In the constituency week, when I was home in my riding, one of my constituents said, as we discussed the blockades and discussed inconvenience and discussed what it means for settler culture Canadians to face inconvenience when Indigenous people have had their land stolen from them, their children stolen from them, their culture stolen from them, and efforts to annihilate who they are as peoples. We have to weigh our inconvenience against the challenge of the moment. And this one constituent said to me, Priscilla said, can't we focus on the opportunity of such a rich conversation? When I heard some of the words of my colleagues, the words of the Leader of the Official Opposition reminded me of something, so I flipped through to them. Their words heard in on May 4th, 1877, actually, General Oliver Otis Howard, speaking of the frustrations he felt of dealing with the Nez Percé and their chiefs as they discussed what mattered to them. And he said, quote, 20 times over and over, I hear the earth is your mother. I want to hear it no more, but come to business at once. This is not simple, and it won't end overnight because it's based on a century and a half of injustice, oppression, and colonialism. But it's also based on the reality that since 1997, the Wet'suwet'en have had every reason to believe that based on the Supreme Court of Canada decision, the federal government would come talking about what does it mean that title for the Wet'suwet'en could be 22,000 square kilometers. What does it mean that the Supreme Court of Canada has said that their title and their Indigenous form of government that predates Canada by thousands of years has status in Canadian law? We must not ever set out the notion that there's a rule of law on one side and Indigenous peoples on the other. Indigenous peoples have the law on their side, and maybe the leader of the official opposition, referring to a small group of radical activists, meant the 9 judges of the Supreme Court of Canada. Because they're the ones who said title is title is title. And Indigenous title is, quote, collective and intergenerational. And acknowledging that will explain why we stand in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en hereditary leadership. My colleague, the honourable member from Nanaimo Ladysmith, went up January 19th, met with hereditary leadership of Wet'suwet'en, came back and we've been trying as Greens to appeal to the federal government from the beginning. Don't let the RCMP arrest people. Don't let the RCMP, that huge encampment, what that cost Canada, a whole year of a remote location of RCMP detachment encampment on the edge of Wet'suwet'en territory. It's very remote. My colleague, the member for Nanaimo Ladysmith, got there and found that, yes, they had offered an alternative route. This was acknowledged, by the way, in the injunction case that granted an injunction to Coastal Gaslink. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs had offered another location that avoided the Quees Trail, but Coastal Gaslink, according to the court, unilaterally rejected the alternative. The federal government has to step up here. I'm glad the federal government is stepping up. It's true that on February 5th in this place, the Prime Minister said that this, quote, this is an issue entirely within provincial jurisdiction, unquote. That's true insofar as the pipeline goes. It doesn't cross a provincial border. But it's massively untrue when we talk about Indigenous rights, the Delgamuukw decision of 1997, the Chilcotin decision of 2014, and the big question, when First Nations win in our courts, what's the statute of limitations on us doing anything about it? The Wet'suwet'en have been enormously patient, and the Unistoten camp has been sitting there for 10 years. Ce n'est pas une question de grande surprise qu'il y a résistance des peuples autochtones partout au Canada. C'est clair. Il y a clair dans toutes les ententes. The Indigenous leadership across Canada has been saying for quite some time, if someone marches on your territory, we'll respond as if they've marched on our territory. This is an aspect of solidarity, but for the solidarity of Indigenous peoples across Canada and their allies, people like me, people who are settler culture Canadians who recognize that this is a turning point for this country, where we actually mean what we say. When I heard the brilliant comment of the brilliant Senator and former Justice Murray Sinclair from the other place, who said, what is this once again, as in Paul Simon and the Boxer, a pocket full of mumbles, such are promises. We must set aside our pocket full of mumbles. We must be serious in our intent. This is a land issue. This is a title issue. This is a justice issue. And it is only very incidentally a pipeline issue. C'est clair maintenant, on doit faire face à la réalité d'injustice, on doit faire face à la réalité et le grand promesse de réconciliation.
And the promise of reconciliation. Now is the time to say yes to Indigenous peoples and no to the yelling that we hear from others to say that this is a group of radicals. That's not true. This is a group that is committed to a large
now is the moment for
project.
Canada to face our moment of truth. Our moment of truth, justice, and reconciliation. Thank you.
Resuming debate, l'honorable
ministre.
J'aimerais informer la Chambre qu'en raison des déclarations ministérielles, les ordres émanant du gouvernement seront prolongés de 43 minutes. So, resuming debate, the honorable minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, today.
Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, share this video, and keep up to date on what's going on.